Welcome to Beyond the CapEx, where we have real stories about mastering capital projects through leadership, vision, and execution.
All right. Good morning, Luis. Another episode of Beyond the CapEx. How are you today?
Right, doing good. Beyond the CapEx.
Awesome, awesome. This is our fifth recording, so this is great. I'm excited. Hopefully, it only keeps getting better from here. So we'll see how it turns out today. So let me ask you this, Luis. Have you ever, or the audience, you guys ever started a simple project? So say at your home, and like let's say change the stove in your kitchen. But as you're doing that, suddenly it just becomes like, oh, how about the countertop? Since we're taking the stove off, the next thing you know is a backsplash, and you look at the floor, it's like, oh, how about the floor? And next thing you know, you got a gigantic kitchen remodeling project in your hands. That's, my friends, is what we call scope creep, and that doesn't just happen in home renovations. It's one of the biggest silent killers in industrial capital projects. What do you think about that, Luis?
I think it's the biggest challenge of executing a project. And I say that because all great intentions are typically what drives scope creep. I mean, go back to your example of your house project. And for anyone who has ever built a house with their partner, you may relate to this. So you're Christian, and I know you and your wife have recently built a house, and let's just call your wife the CEO. She is the key stakeholder. And when
Oh,
you
that's
guys
right.
agree, when you, when you guys agreed on that budget for the house, as the house is getting built, you always end up with the let's change this, or let's add this new, let's change the tile design in the bathroom. Well, why don't we move the toilet to that side? So, those are all the consequences of great ideas for timing. And really, that's what scope creep is. We're going to define scope creep as the things that start encroaching on budget. Well, they affect budget, they affect schedule. It's scope that wasn't originally planned. So scope creep, for our viewers, we're going to define scope creep as those things that occur after the project has been sanctioned, after final investment decision, after the approvers of the pocketbook made those approvals.
All right, good. Tell a little story about scope creep, or a little story, and tell me how much scope creep that is. And so there was a time when I was at a project, and it's a small, relatively small project. And we got out there, and one of the VPs wanted to visit, and we were in the middle of construction. And he goes there and he stands there and starts hand waving changes. And how about we put this conveyor here and move that there? I like to see three stuff here. Can't remember exactly what it was, but I do remember it being quite a bit of hand waving. And what happened then was that, well, everybody said yes. Nobody wants to say no to the big boss, and that's particularly one of the issues that I would like to talk more, or would like to deep dive a little more further on in today's show. But at that point, everybody moved earth and skies, heaven, whatever, to make that happen. And they made it happen, but at some point, it blew the budget and it went back to that very same VP for approval. And it wasn't pretty. It wasn't pretty. And that, for us, that was a hard learned lesson at that company. It was a relatively new company as well. And the project director at that point, he implemented a scope change management and for the project, and that will require the executives to do that, or anybody signs to sign and approve. So the rule became that the CEO could come down to the floor, and no change would be done until that suggested change was essentially sanctioned.
Yeah, that's a good point, Christian. Over my career, I have, so here's the delicate balance. Scope creep is really a culture. We all have great ideas. Everybody's got great intentions. And when executing a job, you've got to establish the culture, the expectations, the parameters, and the rules by which you're going to progress this project. I've worked in an operating environment. I've worked on the owner's side. I've worked on the EPC contractor side. And I've never come across really anybody scope creeping intentionally. It's cultural alignment. So as the project progresses past that point where it was funded, great ideas are coming from people, but they add up, and not not everyone understands the implications of these ideas implemented at the wrong time. So it's a balance, because as that project is being evolved in the early FEL stages, you're encouraging a team to come up with the next great idea. You want creative thinking, you want the juices flowing, you want excitement across your team so that we do the right thing. And at some point, you put pencils down, you get approval on the project, and all of a sudden your messaging to your team is now, okay, there's no more changes without approvals because we are now executing. So it's a balance. It's a cultural balance.
Now, just want to clear up, that doesn't mean that a good idea, a really good idea, should not be brought up forward or implemented late in the project. It's how you do it, and how you filter those ideas, as to not to allow all of them in at a very inconvenient time. I would add to what you said to the definition, the fact that it is usually a lot of is usually not a one big major change that costs a lot of money. It tends to be a whole bunch of small, seemingly very manageable things or good idea that get at it, but they do stack up and grow up to a budget busting, unmanageable chaos. And that sneaks up if you're not
Yeah.
careful.
Well, let's distinguish between necessary scope evolution and what we're going to call scope creep. So scope evolution is the progressing of the project. I like to call projects elaborate evolution. You're elaborating on what you know and evolving the scope. So at some point, you've got that scope very well defined. You've received input from all of the stakeholders, and the key here is the word stakeholders. It's important that all people that will have input into this project have been engaged at the appropriate time, so that you flush out what's necessary for them and what's important for them to have made it into the scope, so that the sanctioners of the project are sanctioning the full scope of the project. So that is scope evolution. Once that project has been sanctioned, now control mechanisms need to be rigorous. The culture of the team needs to be there, where everyone is moving forward wanting to protect scope growth so that you don't allow creep in. Having changing metallurgy on piping while it's being executing, as an example. And this was an example that I wanted to use earlier. Let's say you're running a carbon steel line, and your metallurgist gave you some feedback that it's not going to give us the life that we want, or we can significantly improve the life by changing the metallurgy to stainless. Well, that's a great that's a great scope definition prior to the project being sanctioned. Once the project has been sanctioned, there's a significant cost difference in changing metallurgy. If the pipe has already been purchased, there are all kinds of implications in the supply chain. So scope creep really needs to be embedded in the culture of a team.
I will say scope creep prevention. I know
Right.
what you mean. I know what
Scope
you mean.
creep scope creep prevention, right. We don't want budgets. You look at projects, and outside of the unknown consequences, it's scope creep that drives cost and schedule up
I'll
on
say
the
I'll add
majority of projects.
surprises to that too, because see, one of the concerns with the scope creep and lack of discipline, and I'll get into that a little later, is that in a complex project, you got multiple departments working on different things. Not all ideas come from the top. Many, if not most of the ideas, are coming from people doing the actual work. And let's say that someone within a department comes up with a good idea, and they discuss it within the department, thinking, okay, we're doing the right thing, we're talking it out, and they decide to greenlight it, and then that becomes part of the project scope. Now, the implication is that more often than not, that idea, as good as it might be, has an impact across the project. Maybe not in every department, but perhaps in multiple. And I'll give you an example, a particular example. Say that the control team is doing a startup sequence on their control system. they're designing it, they were good. Somebody comes up with a great idea. And then that department implements that idea, doesn't communicate it or doesn't sanction it, doesn't make it known. You got multiple issues there. On one, possibly extending the schedule, maybe not overall for the project, but you will extend the schedule for that portion of it, and assuming that no one else depends on that, um, might be okay. But it might increase the cost because there's additional hours involved in that. But worst of all, and what I want to get to, is that in these complex projects, usually, if it's large enough, operations is training on a simulator that is based on whatever was designed by controls. So if controls changes it and does not communicate it, and that communication doesn't formally propagate, then how are they going to be informed? Now you have an operations team training on something that is not going to be there or is going to be different when it's time for startup. And you can see how this starts getting complicated, because now you're in a startup. They realize that now you cannot start up on time. Now you got to retrain all the operators, and it just keeps getting complicated, costly. And so that's scope creep at an action, now complicated with cascading effects. Right? We can do a whole other episode on that, cascading failure rather. But that's what I want to communicate. It's it requires discipline and clarity to do this correctly.
And culture, discipline, clarity. And I keep going back to that word culture, because a well-tuned project team is moving in the same direction, aligned on the objectives and the goals. And that's what scope creep does. Scope creep starts affecting business goals, schedule objectives, cost objectives. Even though the ideas are great, adding some additional features to a piece of equipment while in execution may sound like a great idea from a technical perspective, but are the man hours from your execution team capable of performing that, and not affecting schedule and cost? It's all about timing. Let's talk about why scope creep happens. What is the root cause? Well, from it's either bad planning, misalignment between sponsors, or lack of a disciplined change management process. Those are really the major buckets of why it happens.
So, I'll bring it back to people and say, I'm like John Maxwell said, I'm a big believer of one of his big statement is everything raises and falls on leadership. And strong leaders create clarity, set boundaries, give their teams permission to say no, or at least not yet, right? And that sets the tone, sets the culture that you're talking about, and within that framework, then you can create that structure or that formality of a and I'm being redundant a little bit here, but of a formal change process. I want to avoid saying MOC because it often gets confused with the process safety management of change, but we're talking about specifically for project scope in this case. Okay.
And I think that's the brute force way of handling it. Over the course of my career, I've seen it managed from where the president of the company will be the approver of any scope deviations or scope adders. That's when things are out of control. When you've got to engage your highest level of leadership to protect scope growth, that to me that's an indication of
You
poor
got other
scoping.
issues.
You've got other issues if you're resorting to that particular strategy, and that is a strategy that shows that misalignment occurred, and there's going to be blame. Either the operations folks were not engaged early enough, the maintenance folks' ideas were not implemented soon enough, the subject matter experts did not perform their adequate levels of reviews. But when you start asking yourself, well, why do we need to do this? Why is it important? And you're relying on the approver being your highest level in your organization, that's an indication that you have a problem.
Agreed. 100% agreed. And bring it back to leadership. If you had asked me, say the question, so why it happens is, I'll say the simple answer would be because we're human, right? And when a stakeholder wants to add just one thing, say that's your boss or the boss's boss or an important or a key stakeholder, no one wants to be the guy that says no, because it's hard to say no to your boss. You often people are afraid to get fired. Now, how you say it matters a lot. But creating a culture, a structure within the team where that's allowed and properly managed, it matters. It could be the difference between failing on the project and having a disaster waiting to happen to one that is actually workable, enjoyable, and that succeeds. I've been in that position where I'm the guy that says no, and everybody opens the eyes. Very, very big, and it's not easy. It's not pleasant. Even being the one standing up, say no. That's why I go back to how you say it matters a lot, because I've done it both ways. My learning experience and after the learning experience,
Right.
but
Yeah.
but that permission has to be there, and in a complex project that has to be a formalized. It's okay in a small project, probably 2 people, 3 people, 5 people working on it. You got a complex project, you got hundreds of people working on it, and it needs to be formalized.
I've spent both sides. I've spent time on both sides of the fence, and I now appreciate on the contractor side, the folks constructing and doing the EPC execution, the challenges that are faced. I mean, the projects themselves are challenging to execute, and those teams they've got a mountain to climb in just getting the agreed to scope installed. But perceived small changes have these rippling effects that significantly impact the flow of work. Look at it from this perspective. You're executing a job. We'll make it a very small job. Painting a house. And your contractor has hired his painters. He's got 3 painters. The budget approver says house must be painted by this day. I have a party. It's a very important party and the house must be painted on this day. If you start adding additional requirements onto the contractor that's executing the job, painting your house, he's only got 3 workers. And if you're adding additional rooms and potentially changing colors or adding scope, like, well, I need the trim work painted, he's only got so many hours in a day and he can only execute the work at a certain speed. So it's either he's working at night or hiring more resources to try to overcome the mountain of requests that has been implemented onto him. And that's the same concept that occurs on large scale projects. These great ideas really affect the flow of work that has already been planned for by your execution contractor. The resources have been planned, the time to perform the work has been planned, contingencies have been put in place for things that normally occur during execution of the job, your rain delays, materials showing up late from your supply chain, and putting those burdens and stresses of scope creep really needs to be managed, and it's within your capabilities of managing. Let's discuss the true cost of scope creep. I've got an example of what's not necessarily scope creep, but I recall a project that was being executed, relatively large project, $500 million type project. And during execution, folks were looking for ways to cost save and schedule save. And engineers were coming up with some ideas to remove valves from the system. And they did a study and identified a series of valves that could be removed. And at the end of the day, it turned out that the schedule was going to be affected negatively by removing the valves. The execution of the job was going to end up costing more by removing the valves because the engineering had already been accomplished. The valves have already been purchased, and waving hands and coming up with, well, just don't install them. It's not that easy. If the timing is wrong, recycling the engineering, recycling the planning efforts, recycling the piping fabrication, to ensure that the pipe was long and the flanges were not there for the valves cost more problems than to just leave it as is and keep moving forward with what was planned, what was agreed to. And you don't have an understanding of that until you're sitting on that execution side, seeing the repercussions of it's going to cost you schedule if you do that. It's going to cost you more money if you do that. Might not sound logical, but it's all about timing.
Plus the risk, and that's a part that is easy to miss. And let me elaborate a little bit on the risk part. So even if it's not like a risky process per se, but the risk to the project, it's that, like for instance, you say you lock down the scope, now you're ready to move into full blast engineering and all that. In essence, you're bringing this battalion of people working in every possible thing that you can think of. Now you throw a wrench at it, trying to change something. Suppose as doing it when the time was appropriate, where you may have had to change 3 pieces of paper, um, and for a consistency check, make sure that instead of them saying 35, now they all say 34, whatever. Problem is that once you sanction, you move forward, and you got all these battalion of people, a whole bunch of documentation based on the original scope has been generated. It becomes very easy, and I mean that it's very easy to miss a piece of paper that needs to be changed. And while that sounds trivial, piece of paper, that piece of paper may be the one that a critical piece of design is relying on to do that. And there have been accidents, tragically, unfortunately, to where that exactly has happened. Somebody came up with a change in design late in the game, and it wasn't properly managed. And I was watching the other day, I was watching a documentary. I was thinking, oh, this is an example of what we're about to talk in the show. If I recall correctly, it was a shopping mall, an atrium or something. And now I'm not a civil engineer, so forgive me if I'm saying all the civil structural things wrong.
I'm a civil engineer, so I'll cover you there.
So if I recall correctly, the design was relying on a single column and a single bolt or nut or something that was holding the load. But as they changed the design when the contractor were going to put it together, it didn't fit because it was not the same thing, and that had been already purchased. So they had to, if I recall correctly, again, they had to like slightly change it or something like that.
I know the case. I know the case. I studied that case. I believe it was a Hyatt hotel, and that resulted in an accident with fatalities where the constructor came up with a constructability idea that resulted in changing the design, and it was not properly vetted. And structurally, the loads on the components were doubled after it was
That's
executed,
what it
and
was. Yes.
it resulted in a failure on inauguration of the hotel and consequences of fatalities.
Thanks for clarifying that, Luis. That's exactly the case that I was talking about. Is that when you change something late in the game, there's a lot of documentation associated with that needs to be reviewed, and it's easy to miss a critical detail that can ultimately end up in, like in this case, in fatalities, and nobody wants that, right? So I can't stress enough how important is to be disciplined about this, to have a culture that allows these changes to go through a proper vetting process. And frankly, I think every change after sanctions should be treated as its own mini business case, and well, business and technical case, but both, because everything has to be evaluated as its own mini project and how it fits into the actual project.
And and also understand that it puts stress on the team as you're progressing the project and you're identifying these potential changes. That requires resources to be deflected to analyze those changes and study them from a technical perspective, from a business perspective, to then have it evaluated by the sponsors. So it takes time away from the work that also needs to be executed or was already planned to be executed. It's the most difficult thing on executing a project to manage and balance scope creep. I think fundamentally that's the art of project execution, managing scope creep.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. So, Luis, what can we give the audience some actionable items to actually try to prevent this scope creep?
Well, when you start off your project with strong governance and discipline, and that occurs at the front end stage. You ensure that you've got an execution plan and an execution strategy that ensures completeness in that front end planning stage. It's important to have gone through a stakeholder alignment and stakeholder identification in building consensus through your leadership team and your key stakeholders. A poor stakeholder engagement results in stakeholder misalignment, results in great ideas showing up at the wrong time. And then your change management process is part of how you're going to execute. And hopefully, you're not requiring the president of your company to be the authorizer of changes. That's when you've got problems. Your leadership team, your subject matter experts, the culture embedded in the project should be one where all great ideas have been encouraged. The team is working hard to lock scope. And once scope has been locked, the team is now asking themselves, well, is this operable? Is it safe? And how may I potentially impact my business case that the folks have sanctioned? If it's a great idea that still merits consideration, you might need to park it. And you should have a log that documents great ideas that should be considered either as a subsequent project or as a lessons learned for the next project.
To that, I would add a few things that I usually tell my clients to make sure they have, and that's a project charter. You'd be surprised how many projects I've seen that no one knows what they're building. And in terms of knowing and aligning everyone, that's a very, very useful tool that I think every project should have, a proper charter. Another piece of document that we have been promulgating recently is a functional scope. And what these two do is that make sure that every idea is filtered through those and serve that purpose. Because one of the challenges that you also face with scope creep is ending up with a project that has nothing to do with the original intention. I'll give you an example. For instance, on the functional scope, it's a very simple document, basically, and I'm oversimplifying it, but basically all it does is state what are we doing. For instance, the function of this plant that we are building is to take A plus B, do some magic, and turn it into C plus D. Period. Again, oversimplification. On one of the projects that I was working recently, somebody came up with the idea, hey, we're producing this, we might produce some of this side stream. There might be some commercial use. Why don't we prioritize that? And that might make this a whole more profitable. So that sounds like a great idea, and it may very well be, but it does add a lot of scope. It does have, consequently, along with that, adds a lot of cost and schedule to something that was already in motion. And when you go back to the functional scope, the plan is not intended to do that. Now, should they do it or not? Maybe, but the point is that right away flags it as something that has to go through a thorough management of change process in order to make sure that whoever sanctioned the project agrees with changing the entire project, as opposed to coming up, adding all that, and then having at the end of the day something that is not quite what they really intended in the first place.
I'm going to say that the owner's team really are the ones that own scope creep. Your contractor is going to execute what you've requested of them. And I've spent time there where I've seen the owner's team, and I can't also speak about specific projects, but I've seen the owner's team members come up with great ideas at the wrong time and without being monitored or controlled by the leadership of the owner. That's a tough situation to be in as a contractor, because you're trying to make your client happy, but your client is not managing their team members adequately to protect scope and manage scope creep. The burden lies with the owner and the owner's team and the owner's leadership to establish protecting scope.
All right. So, Luis, I think this has been great. Is any last thought you'd like to add to what we've discussed so far?
Well, it's the most difficult art to manage on executing a job. Once the sanctioning has occurred and the funding has been released, it's hard. It's hard to manage scope creep because you're dealing with it on a daily basis. And be willing to park the great ideas. We don't want to discourage the great ideas. Go ahead and log them, document them, learn from them, and protect your scope.
Me thinking last minute thinking, just a last minute thought about these is that like when you say park these great ideas, it may very well be the first plant-owned project after it's operating. And that might actually be more efficient, might be more efficient and effective to do it right after the plant starts up than trying to throw that wrench into an already ongoing project. Consider that. All right. Well, that's all for today. And thanks for tuning in. And if you're got your own scope creep story, feel free to share it with us. And got any questions you'd like for us to answer in the show, email us at podcast@bpmpsolutions.com and we will answer. All right. With that said, you all have a good day. And thanks
Have a
for
great
listening.
day. Thank you.
Since you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the episode, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too.